happy to be here with you guys.
Thanks, Mike. Well, we have some exciting news. I guess first I wanted to just, if you could start, Mike, with a little bit of Microsoft's investment and background in the blockchain space.
So yeah, Microsoft has invested in blockchain in multiple different areas. So first and foremost around building the community. And so many of the projects that we have are completely open source. And so we're the #1 contributor on GitHub, and we've continued that tradition even with blockchain. Everything from samples to our latest blockchain developer toolkit, where we've got about 15 to 20 scenarios that we've enabled where you're tying in things like AI and IoT and mobility, even things that you deal with in third world countries like text messages and how to integrate those things into the blockchain. So that's one component, but the second component is really driving the market forward. So, we're a board member of the Ethereum Enterprise Alliance, and we're building standards. We're helping define, there was a question earlier about tokenization. There's going to be an announcement. I can't go into any details at the moment, but here over the next couple of weeks, there's a cross Enterprise Ethereum Alliance project for tokenization to really simplify how we think about tokens. So that's coming. And then third, from a technology perspective, our platform. Our philosophy around all of our technologies these days with cloud is about building a platform as a service. Blockchain is no different. And so we are ledger agnostic. We don't care what ledger you use. But what we're here to do is to connect all these things together, integrate it into your existing line of business systems, and really help accelerate what you're trying to do. And so that's a great segue to Mr. Steve here to talk about how we intersect in that type of philosophy.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. So Kaleido is part of ConsenSys. ConsenSys is the largest blockchain company in the world. It has a consulting arm. It has lots of different arms, but the arm that we want to talk about is kind of legs even. We want to talk about the products and capabilities that ConsenSys is incubating. One of those is Kaleido. Kaleido is a blockchain platform as a service. So you can go to Kaleido.io, you can sign up and create your own account, spin up your own network, and lots of integrated tools and services with that. And that's kind of where we've taken Kaleido to kind of make it unique. We recognize that the chain is just one piece of what you're trying to do in a blockchain project. And increasingly, we're seeing many blockchain or distributed technologies used together to form a single solution, whether that's storage or oracles or data feeds, advanced cryptography components, off-chain to on-chain identity, many other things. So a typical enterprise project has 40 components to it, and a decent percentage of those exist around the chain. And so what we're announcing today is a partnership with Microsoft. Now, Microsoft has partnered with ConsenSys on many levels. Mike was laying out kind of Microsoft's broad participation in the blockchain ecosystem. ConsenSys is also quite involved in the blockchain ecosystem. From everything from developer tools, which Microsoft excels at, and ConsenSys side, there's Truffle with 1 million downloads, and Ethereum, that's the .NET Ethereum client, and so on, to other vertical solutions that are being platformed on Microsoft. And Kaleido is really agnostic. We share a lot of similar beliefs and values about blockchain and how it fits into the enterprise world. So this is really a great match. And what this means from a practical perspective is you can go to the Azure Marketplace right now. You can search for blockchain. Kaleido has a nice shiny new tile. You can log in with through your Active Directory ID. Automatically, you're created what we call a starter plan in Kaleido, which is a perpetually free plan. Set up your own chain, and you're off and running.
I guess probably would be interesting for folks here today just to understand, what's driving these sorts of advancements in the platform and the partnering, what sort of needs you're hearing from consortiums and clients as they're going live into production and looking to grow and scale their networks and blockchain.
Sure. So I'll start us off. I think there's a big problem just around skill sets, right? And the more we can do as technology providers to not only educate and uplift folks, but also make it a lot easier to use these technologies. So, just like with Kaleido, Microsoft has invested heavily in accelerators, logic apps, where you've got either low-code or no-code solutions to automate and to get your solutions out the door if you've got fairly, straightforward functionality. And so that's a key part of the strategy as well, is we want to make sure we lower that barrier to entry for these large corporations that may not have either the funds or even the foresight on where to invest in blockchain. So lowering that barrier of entry is really, really critical in my mind of many things. But I want, Steve, you to chime in as well, and we'll kind of go back and forth on some of our insights.
Yeah, I'll mention too that we hear from clients really on a regular basis, right, Sophia? One is, I was alluding to it a moment ago, it's kind of realizing that blockchain is more than the chain. We call that full stack blockchain. So thinking about blockchain as a computing platform. It's not just a node that this little node that you stand up and it runs and there's an operating system process running and everything's fine. If you're doing something as fundamental, which a lot of people are in their industries, of reimagining how you collaborate with your partners and your customers and your ecosystem, then we're talking about a serious bit of computing. And likely there's a ledger, right? So we're talking about going into the back office all the way to the bottom of the stack, whether there's a mainframe there or some really old system that's doing the core functions that makes your business function. And so blockchain is really the first time in decades, in almost all cases that we see, that you're reaching all the way down there and you're ripping up through many layers of IT stacks that we've accumulated over a long period of time. And now you're trying to reimagine that across your business ecosystem. The second challenge then is, how in the world do you do that, right? How do you do that as Sophia was saying, as a consortium or a collection of organizations? And Mike, that's something that you have a particular perspective on, having years of overseeing blockchain at Gartner, talking with many customers, and now Microsoft as well.
Yeah, and the whole consortium space, that's, we're really focusing our efforts there because that's really where we see the growth in blockchain. And just like the challenges that you had mentioned, Steve, it's one thing going down that stack with one company. Now you've got an ecosystem of 5, 10, 15, 20 companies where you've got to do the same thing. And so understanding how to architect an ecosystem is a very different motion than what we've been used to traditionally. Very different way of thinking about things. The data becomes even more important than what it used to be. And so there is a focus on data science, how we should architect that data, where should data live, where shouldn't it live, things like regulation around GDPR and other things. And then you start to get into, like the last conversation, we talked about the legal side. I've gotten more lawyers involved in blockchain here over the past couple of years than I ever have in any other project. And so, we really need to understand the business and economic model on what are the incentive drivers for each company as part of your consortium, not just your one singular company. So it requires organizations to not only rethink their technology stack, but they've got to rethink how they do business, okay? And this really requires a level of, what I refer to as being comfortable, being uncomfortable. Taking a step back and understanding, yes, we've been doing this the same way for the past 30 years, but will this be the same process that will sustain me for the next 5 to 10 years? And that's a difficult question to ask yourself, and there's an enormous amount of anxiety in the industry. And so whether it's at Gartner or Microsoft, we have deep ideation workshops with not just the CIO organization or CTOs, but executive board of director level individuals that have a real anxiety around where this market is going. And if they are not the leader in these consortiums, they could get pushed out to the fray. And someone else, whether it's a competitor they know or a competitor they don't know, could start to define their business going forward. So we want to understand those aspects, but also ground ourselves in reality as well. We talked about this earlier around multi-cloud. You know what? I'm a Microsoft shareholder, so yes, I'm going to say, you should do lots of Microsoft. However, in the real world, many companies have made bets for a variety of reasons, whether it be a financial enterprise license agreement, or it's a preference, or they might say, hey, we want to diversify, and we don't want to be locked into one platform. That is our reality. We're in a hybrid world. And so we have to make sure that when we architect these solutions, that we also consider we might not even know the technology stack, right? So lots of considerations that we have to think about this very, very differently.
So I think a couple good points with blockchain, being comfortable with being uncomfortable. And then, people are worried about being disintermediated because a lot of blockchain is looking at reimagining business processes and sort of the function of intermediaries, and now sort of decentralizing the network for business cases. I mean, I think it might be helpful to the folks here, just if Mike, you want to share, and then Steve, like some good examples of what people are doing that you think is interesting on the blockchain.
Yeah, that's what's interesting about blockchain is there's just all these great examples of what's going on in the marketplace. Everything from combating what's happening in the wine industry around counterfeit wine, where you see in some countries that shall remain nameless, where you see a lot of refilling bottles and putting a wax tip on there and saying, oh well, yes, this is a brand new bottle of wine, to very, very real issues around food safety. The whole farm to fork scenario around making sure that we don't have issues with E. coli and things along those lines, to very real industrial strength supply chain examples, where I'm working with one very large global aviation company that is looking to essentially automate a 21,000 independent data point supply chain. Use blockchain to significantly re-engineer how they interact with their distributors, suppliers, etc. And why that's important, and you don't realize this at first, how much waste is in the process. You've got human beings that are doing manual inspections with checklists and submitting those checklists, and then someone's got to data entry those checklists eventually. You've got all these accountability issues and small things like, hey, we've got mom and pop companies that are delivering these parts to airlines that they're in startup mode, so capital is really important. Today, it takes this particular company 2 months to pay them for that delivery. Now we can get it down to hours. Now what that does is it frees up capital, so now that small business can grow. They can buy more trucks, more employees, etc. So there's all these hidden costs throughout the supply chain that we don't necessarily immediately think about, that is really exciting for us, because we're seeing all these great new opportunities that we can expose value and also free up people to do much better things. The last example I'll give, because I'm a Microsoft person, is Xbox. So kind of the sexy example. So with the unsexy blockchain solution that we used, which was to automate how we pay publishers, how we pay developers. So today, paying royalties is kind of a pain in the rear. It's highly complicated. Every agreement is different. And there's a lot of discrepancies in the data. And I didn't realize this, but there's a lot of Excel spreadsheets that are passed back and forth over FTP and all sorts of interesting things that are going on. By implementing a blockchain solution, even though it was a founder-led business model, which means Microsoft behind their firewall has all the nodes, even within that model, we were able to cut our operational costs in half. That's a big deal. In the ROI side, as far as tangible hard dollars, we're saving $2 million a quarter. This is material, right? So the reason why that's important is now we can start to branch out and say, okay, Microsoft's done it. Now we've partnered with Ernst & Young to say, let's build out a royalties platform for everybody. And then that's where it starts to get really, really powerful and interesting.
So,
Sorry, I get really excited.
Excel spreadsheets at Microsoft surprised you?
No,
Didn't surprise
can't be.
me too much. Yeah, I think something as fundamental as blockchain and getting all the way to the core of, how you interact with your partners, customers. You're going to see use cases across the board. An interesting lens is to say, okay, 98% of the market is still wrapping their heads around it. Who's really leading the charge, right? Who's in production with these things that they are doing, live systems, and what are some of the learnings or interesting data points coming back from those? And there's a lot of data out there. Gartner, Deloitte, Microsoft, others have published data. And I think the one thing that you'll see that's pretty consistent is the financial services space is leading the charge. You could say they have the most to gain. You could say they have the most to lose. Potato, potato, I guess. And you're really seeing industries collaborate, I think, at a whole nother level than maybe if you grew up in a capitalist society you wouldn't expect to see. And so I think because we're seeing, the commodity sector come forward and, trade live letters of credit on a blockchain, and seeing the processes that have changed underneath that, where there's 75 IT people from 15 banks on a call working together to make sure that, they share the management of the system, I think is really interesting looking forward in how, we get to this $3 trillion of economic impact over the next 15 years. So and there are many other examples in the financial space, in trade finance as well, I think is really leading the charge. And then supply chain, which I think you already covered. Just the complexity of our value systems that we have in our supply chain systems, our value chains. It's really remarkable if you think about what we went to going from email to Facebook, right, and kind of going on to more of a platform from a point-to-point sort of a system. If you think about the B2B world, well, someone like a big retailer, a large manufacturer, their network's a heck of a lot bigger than mine is, I can tell you that. And yet their relationships are all contractual, right? So those things can be automated, and they can, the efficiency can be improved dramatically. And so, what we see at Kaleido, the last thing I'll say is I think it's a lot of fun. Among the most fun parts of our job is, talking to some of the biggest companies in the world 1 hour, and then working with smart-ups, smart startups, doing smart contract stuff, startups, that are quite small and focused on a very specific use case the next hour. And, so the blockchain ecosystem, you really have participation across the whole board.
Yeah, an example of one of those smaller innovative players, more in the startup space, is Green Fence. So they found Kaleido digitally and reached out to us after they were running these production campaigns with digital collectibles for Sony and Fox for movies, for like Goosebumps 2. Now the younger generation doesn't want a movie poster. They want a digital collectible. So you need to create scarcity around that. With like T-Mobile Tuesdays and coupons with Kroger and others, again, that sort of digital scarcity helps with the marketing campaigns. There's a lot of fraud in the digital coupon space, and people could copy it many times over the marketing budget. Just intermediaries also with claiming they placed ads and all of that. So they actually had hundreds of thousands of people downloading the coupon and redeeming it. They had a 69% retention engagement rate, which just is amazing for any sort of marketing campaign. And the consumers don't realize it's a crypto wallet that's delivering a much better coupon for them than they've ever gotten before, which is driving the engagement rate. So blockchain is really an enabling factor, that it's not even just like, oh, I'm using blockchain to do this. It's just helping solve problems both in the on the brand side, and then getting a better deal for consumers, just from a purchasing power perspective. So lots of really interesting use cases from all parts of the market.
So I add one small thing that I want to make sure you guys understand as well is when we look globally, the most interesting places are the emerging markets. Because, here in, the developed worlds, we've got a lot of baggage, we've got a lot of existing stuff that we have to get through. But, some of the most exciting projects that I've worked on is, in Nigeria. Or we worked with New Zealand Air to essentially automate their supply chain and introduce 3D printing of replacement parts. So if, on the engine a sensor says, hey, we're at this risk threshold of something going wrong, let's 3D print a replacement part right there when that plane lands to prevent any sort of issues. So, when we look at the next economic centers, it's not really brick anymore. It's now shifted, and over the next 20 years, it's going to be mint. So Malaysia, Indonesia, Nigeria, and Thailand are going to be the big economic centers. So we want to make sure that also when we're looking at these opportunities, Asia Pacific actually is 2 times the amount of investment in blockchain happens there than it does here.
Yep, I think we're going to go to questions in a minute. I did want to say that if anyone in the audience has a great use case or idea they want to experiment with, as Steve mentioned earlier, Kaleido, you can use our starter plan for free. So in minutes, literally, you can set up a blockchain network or consortium, invite people, get it running, test it out, do an MVP, show it to stakeholders, get some funding, and you're off to the races. So invite you all, kaleido.io, to try that out. So opening for questions? Yep. Here we go.
Thanks very much. Appreciate it. My name is Peter Evans with KPMG in the Innovation Group. So let's suppose I'm a supply chain guy. I run a very large supply chain, but I'm very skeptical about blockchain. So what do you do to convince me and prepare me to go up the chain to say, yes, blockchain is a good solution in terms of business case, ROI, productivity gains? Do you have a methodology for laying that out?
So that's a great question. So yes, and yes would be the simple answer, but the long answer would be yes, you have to have a repeatable and predictable approach to how you address these particular issues. And so, Microsoft, we've invested in essentially a business strategy playbook for building out these blockchain, whether it's a individual solution or a consortium, which most of this is going to lean towards more of a consortium, because why use blockchain if you're only talking to yourself? Doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But we've got a whole methodology around that, and KPMG is a partner, and we like to share with our partners. So definitely, let's talk about that. The next bit of that is tangibly, you asked the question of, well, what does that conversation look like? And so specifically with supply chain, since it's probably our most common use case, a more track and trace type of use case, I've had these conversations quite a few times. And the technique that I use with clients is I say, let's look at your existing process. Let's map it out. And what we find every single time is, one, they don't really know their process. Two, when we actually go and double click and actually look at I don't have to sell them. They see the waste throughout their supply chain. And then we quickly shift to more of an ideation-based approach where we don't get the tech folks necessarily in the room. We get senior architects and we get the business decision makers in these ideation sessions. Because what we want in the room is the people that are writing the checks and the people that would go to jail if bad things happen. Gone are the days when we do a whole bunch of stuff and then we go and sell it to someone. That doesn't work. How do we get them vested in fundamentally re-architecting our business? And so if you do that, it lowers the friction. You also educate them at the same time as we're developing their new business model as well. And so key part of this is shared accountability, getting them educated on the key capabilities, and I'm being very deliberate with my words when I say capability, the technical capabilities that this would provide, the advantages for my business. And when you do it in that way, now you can say, okay, here's your top line business goals. Here's how this will help you. And so, like I mentioned earlier, working with a very large global company that if I said their name, you would know who they are, and know they're not involved in that whole 737 debacle. But which I'm getting on a flight later, and I'm like, oh man, this is going to be an adventure. But at any rate, I digress. But yeah, that's how I would approach it. And let's definitely connect. Anybody else that wants to connect on, I'd be more than happy to walk folks through on how we think through this particular problem.
So we actually do work with a lot of innovation labs. I'd say they're a huge segment, I think, that are able to just move faster. With the platform really helps to go from concept to consortium really in record time. Like I said, just minutes to get spun up. So innovation labs providing this to the lines of business. A lot of it's looking at experimenting, flexibility and choice around consensus mechanisms, protocols, and seeing what's a trade-off between like privacy, performance, other factors. Certainly, I think maybe Steve, you'd want to comment on what you would say to sort of an enterprise B2B mindset about why blockchain is so sort of fundamentally different in approaching some of these age-old problems.
Yeah, well, I guess it is worth pointing out that Gartner and I don't remember exactly who, probably Gartner, has written about how blockchain is unique in that they're observing the reverse happening, where more than any other technology they've seen, there's top-down pressure to go implement something and show value and adopt blockchain and not get left behind. And I think something like somewhere in the 80% plus of executives now are saying they're afraid of being left behind in the blockchain space. So I think we're now in 2019, people, I will say, I'm sure there are specific cases where it's not true, but by and large, there is some amount of kind of knowledge in the herd out there about blockchain. I think probably what really helps with a lot of the innovation teams that we work with is connecting with the lines of business across your organization and finding those first couple of use cases that are, just something you can't say no to.
Sure, yeah.
Such a big pain point in the organization.
So I have a follow-up question for Steve. So you mentioned that the financial sector seems to be where progress is being made, but I think it was in January, McKinsey wrote a blog post that really, I think, challenged that. And so my question would be, they argued that billions have been spent on blockchain pilots and there's not much to show for it. So my question is what is your retort to McKinsey?
Yeah, I actually think that's healthy. In the where we're at in the hype cycle, I think probably more than billions have been spent on various coins out there and investments and things. So I'm not to make light of any of that, but all that to say, I think this is a very predictable trend we see with big technologies like this over and over again, where the expectations get way up here. And we can tell you firsthand from some of the projects that we've walked in and seen people doing, scratching your head, going, "Why there's no blockchain anywhere here? What's going on?" So I think in a lot of cases the cart gets a little bit before the horse, and I think it's very healthy to kind of in the crypto winter, crypto spring, to borrow that sort of phraseology, to see it not all be euphoria and to start seeing counterpoint studies and articles being written, kind of challenging the technology, and what emerges out of that really is the wheat and the chaff. Even though so much has been spent, and perhaps 1% of 1 to 2% organizations in production right now, the economic pie is still in the trillions of dollars. So it still makes economic sense on a large scale. And I think what we need to do is really to take the learnings that we've learned over the last few years, incorporate them into the next generation of the tooling, like Kaleido's doing in the platform, but also on the business side that Mike was touching on earlier, thinking about these things in parallel, making sure that there's a business track that's working out kind of the consortium and how the businesses are going to connect in parallel with the IT teams that are collaborating on how they are going to need to work together. And all of that has to come together to have a successful production blockchain. The good news is when you are in production, then the economic benefits are there. So I don't think the paper was saying anything on that level. It's just reflecting on some of the failed pilots that are out there.
No, I agree with all your points, and I'll just add on a couple more to provide a little bit more context. I didn't read that particular article, but I guess I would be somewhat disappointed in the lack of breadth of understanding of the market because, we track consortiums around the world. And yes, the largest pie is what is categorized as financial services. However, that pie is those scenarios are very diverse. Some are crypto, but a lot of them are not. And a lot of these, what we had categorized as financial services is actually, with a CPG company, right? Because everyone does payments. Everyone does, these financial services-based activities. So not only are we seeing industries start to come together, which makes it very misleading when you look at those types of statistics and insights, but also another key wrinkle here is this is a form of competitive advantage. And I've got customers that say, we will not do a case study because we don't want our competitors to know how well we're doing. We want to keep it a secret because we are now wildly more efficient. It's like with the Xbox royalties program. We could say, hey, this is our competitive differentiation against, Sony or Nintendo or whomever. But we've got a different philosophy. But that's another key component is there's a lot of these consortiums that no one knows about. I wouldn't say bad data. I would say broaden your horizons a little bit and let's look at the broader picture.
Thanks.
Biggest market for sure is KYC. You know your customer on the blockchain. That for me also part of the financial services, legal services, banking service. So I'm hoping that one of you smart people will do some KYC solution once, because that's what we are looking for.
So that's a big space. What are you thinking?
Well, I think that's not only like a turnover market, it's more like a cost-saving market because we are lawyers from Blockchain Island, where we live in Malta, and about 75% of all costs that financial services and legal goes for sure into applying KYC and all the customer. So and this is a picture-perfect example of what blockchain can do.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of examples, and I would go one extreme, you say healthcare. And so I'm working with an organization that says, hey, what if we gave the power to the patient to say where their data should live and not live, and to be able to immediately deprovision your data. So like you've got your health data at your local doctor, your emergency room, 23andMe, and they're using that and selling to GlaxoSmithKline. You might say, hey, I don't like that, right? And you can instantly revoke that. So from a KYC perspective and from a regulatory perspective, that's really key and solves a big, big problem, right? And then on the other side of the extreme is where we talk about loyalty, customer loyalty. We see a ton of initiatives around building loyalty programs around using blockchain and a variety of different techniques that I think have durability, and others, my personal opinion, they don't. But there's lots of solutions in the whole KYC space. So it just depends on what path you want to go down. If it's more legal and compliance, which there's a ton of stuff, and we've partnered with Perkins Coie on you really understanding that in a very material way. And so you touched on the legal component a little bit. There's some of the first questions we ask when we start to boot up these consortiums is the legal questions. Right? And, what are we willing to do? We do a risk-adjusted value on the opportunity. So there's a lot of economic modeling and essentially legal assessment before we even talk about the technology.
Yeah, and we're technology people, so I don't profess to be an expert on any specific domain. I will say, just from my own opinion, it's not scientific, but KYC is in the top 5 or 10 sort of scenarios that we see over and over and over again, especially in the financial world. KYC, by the way, stands for Know Your Customer. It's a legal responsibility that financial companies have to make sure that they're not doing something they shouldn't be, or to someone who's they shouldn't be doing it with. And I believe the reason why KYC comes up so often is, it's just such an obvious one that where it makes sense to pull data together, right? If someone shouldn't have a bank account, then I think every bank, it's not a debate. They're happy to share that information with each other, and they want to become more efficient and become more transparent with regulators that they're compliant, and doing that on a shared network makes sense. We have seen, financial services sort of consortiums or groups start somewhere else, and even in those cases, invariably, often what comes up is a KYC use case. Because when you build a blockchain, at the end of the day, you haven't just built an app, you've actually built a network. Then everyone starts thinking, okay, well, shoot, we have a network. What other use cases does it make sense for us to collaborate on? We're up and we're talking to each other, and KYC comes up a lot.
Yeah, I mean, there's actually a consortium that's live. It has a third of the top 20 banks in the world and various key players in the commodities industry. So they created a separate entity called Comgo. The 15 stakeholders all moved people into there, and they have equity in there. So it's KOMGO if you want to read up on it. So they went live with a letter of credit, as Steve was saying, created this network, are onboarding, growing, and scaling, but KYC is one of their use cases. So often it's going to be in the context of a particular use case that you're looking to solve, and then it's going to be a key capability there as part of that. All right.
Do you have another question?
Yeah, sure.
I'm a lawyer and a law professor as well, and developed the blockchain, cryptocurrency, and law curriculum at our school. And so when the issue of law comes up, and you were mentioning how you work with clients to go from, first of all, showing whatever the inefficient pain points are, moving them quickly to it sells itself, ideation, and bridging the divide between technologists and lawyers, or lawyers in training. What's the sweet spot of making sure that whatever the intent for the parties in terms of the contractual relationships actually can be more efficiently executed through smart contracts? And I'm finding that technologists and legal aren't speaking the same language in order to really have the proper data to drive forward the efficiencies. We have to bridge that divide. So I'm wondering your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I'll take it from 2 vantage points. So I'll take it from the technical folks, their perspective, and then take it from the legal perspective. I think that the developer community, the architects, even the CIOs of the world, they need to realize that there isn't a hard line between IT and quote-unquote the business, right? So whoever came up with the term, we have to align IT to the business, should be shot, right? Because I've been looking for this dude called the business for years. I can't find him, okay? So the most important lesson I think that developers, technologists need to understand is we're doing this for a reason. There is a business reason why we're doing these things. And understanding and appreciating that legal perspective, that you guys aren't trying to be the no people, but rather we're trying to protect the company, right? And so making sure that there is accountability for our technologists as well. They don't have to be experts in our business, but they have to empathize with, okay, yes, this is the type of business we are, this is where we're going as a business, and we have to understand those issues and appreciate those issues and not just say, you know what, it's not my problem, you guys, you lawyers deal with that. There's got to be that shared accountability in the process. Part of the technique that I use to implement that is essentially I get everyone engaged in these ideation sessions. So when I was at Gartner, clients would pay $50,000, $60,000 to have me come for a few hours to do these sessions. And I would tell the client, if we don't have at least 51% of the room as business decision makers, I will not show up or I will walk out of the room because it's a waste of your money to go through a hypothetical exercise. And that's what it turns into, is if you just have one group doing one thing and another group doing another. From the legal side, and I'll even say business decision maker, legal, auditors, all that great stuff, is we don't live in a world where it's just the business anymore. It's every business is a technology business. And so it's incumbent upon these other roles to understand technology as well. There's no business on this planet that could run, without technology. So there has to be an appreciation for that. And so most times it's about how do we ingrain this into the culture, have a culture of innovation, but also understanding that a lot of the rules that we've established are based on technologies from 30 years ago, and that we've got new options now, and we can solve these problems in different ways. A very simple example, 10 years ago when we talked about BYOD, bring your own device, and all the lawyers were up in arms. You can't do that. What about our data, right? Very simple workaround. Every employee will sign an agreement that says, we will sue you if you do bad things. Problem solved, right? And so it's also incumbent upon our business decision makers, lawyers, auditors, et cetera, to also be practical and understand that we are in this hyper growth with technology, and there is some risk, but taking more of a financial advisor type of viewpoint on this. What I go back to in these workshops is the notion of risk-adjusted value. So these technologies, you may make billions of dollars, but do you have the appetite for these particular risks that it exposes? What that does is now the lawyers are talking the same language as the developers, as the business folks that are super ambitious to getting this out the door, et cetera. You have now a common framework in which you can have these discussions. And it's a business conversation. Does that make sense? Okay.
Yeah, and I'll say, as the tech person, the first 15 years of my career was, here's IT, and legal is somewhere over the wall, somewhere, and they eventually, occasionally pop up and tell you how you've done something wrong. And I will say blockchain breaks a lot of molds. And we talked about how, the business organization around the consortium concept, we talked about shared IT and the IT stream. But another facet of that, as we're doing these kind of real blockchain implementations and getting all these organizations together and forming work groups across the organizations, legal is there. And, I've seen those different groups and stakeholders now collaborating amongst themselves in ways that I don't think, that we've been doing to date in the IT space. So I think that's positive. I think, legal fits into the blockchain world because it brings new challenges and problems. There are lots of promising areas that we need legal help in to understand around regulation, around privacy and compliance, many areas. One that I wanted to highlight, though, is, this is the last thing that I'll mention, is there's a very promising space that we talk about, legal smart contracts, and nodding your head, you're involved there. I think there's a huge value proposition to make back to the business, to one of the prior questions of justifying it to the business, of saying, hey, if you're going to rewrite your kind of core business logic about how you do KYC or how we're processing transactions, why don't we use this opportunity in the form of a smart contract to bring legal, to make those digital things legally binding. And I think kind of bringing in composable legal smart contracts is a fascinating piece of this puzzle that's happening right before our very eyes. As ConsenSys, there is a team that focuses on that called Open Law. I'm not sure if you're connected with them. We're happy to do that. And then on Kaleido, in our kind of full stack philosophy, click. You want an open law as part of your blockchain. Click and deploy, and you have it. So I think we've probably gone over by the look in Troy's
It's
face. But
okay.
it's a great
No,
discussion.
it's totally fine, actually. We have time. I just wanted to let everyone know that we will be resuming again at 1 o'clock with the future of banking. You did actually talk about finance, so we will be talking about DeFi at 1 o'clock. So stick around, and we'll be resuming then. Thank you.
All right.
Thanks, everybody.